Imagine standing on the walls of Constantinople in the year 1450, watching the sun set over the Golden Horn. The water burns copper and gold, reflecting light off domes that have stood for 1,000 years. Behind you, the city breathes, a living relic of an empire that once stretched from Spain to Syria, from the Danube to the deserts of North Africa. But now those walls enclose all that remains of Rome, not the Rome of the Caesars. That city fell to Germanic tribes a millennium ago. This is the other Rome, the eastern half, the Greek-speaking Christian empire that survived the Dark Ages, outlasted the Crusades, and endured waves of invaders who all believed they could break it. They called it the Queen of Cities, they called it the Eye of the World, and in the middle of the 15th century it was dying magnificently. The year is 1450. 3 years before, everything changes forever. Constantinople was never meant to fall. Constantine the Great chose this spot in 324 AD because it was perfect, a triangular peninsula jutting into the sea, protected on two sides by water, and on the third by the most formidable defensive walls ever constructed by human hands. The Theodosian walls rose like mountains of stone, triple-layered barriers that had turned back Huns, Avars, Arabs, and Bulgars. 21 times armies had crashed against these walls. 21 times they had broken. The city within was a marvel that defied description. The Hagia Sophia dominated the skyline, a dome so massive, so impossibly suspended above empty air, that people whispered it was held up by angels. Built by Emperor Justinian 9 centuries earlier, its interior glittered with golden mosaics depicting Christ, Pantocrator, the Virgin Mary, saints and emperors frozen in eternal glory. Light poured through 40 windows ringing the base of the dome, creating the illusion that the ceiling floated, weightless, above the worshippers below. But by 1450, there were fewer worshippers every year. The population that once numbered 500,000 had dwindled to perhaps 50,000 souls. Entire neighborhoods lay abandoned, their houses collapsing into gardens gone wild, their streets reclaimed by silence. Farmers planted crops between ruined palaces. Goats grazed in the forums where emperors once received the adoration of millions. The city had become too large for the civilization trying to hold it. Yet what remained was breathtaking. The great palace of the Byzantine emperors sprawled across terraces descending toward the Sea of Marmara, a complex of throne rooms, reception halls, churches, and gardens that had accumulated over 11 centuries. Most of it stood empty now, its mosaics fading, its fountains dry. Emperor Constantine XI, Palaiologos, and the last emperor, though he didn't know it yet, kept court in the smaller palace of Blashernai near the land walls. More defensible, more practical, less haunted by the ghosts of greatness. The city's wealth had not entirely vanished. The merchants of Constantinople still traded in silk from China, spices from India, furs from Russia, and grain from the Black Sea ports that Genoa now controlled. The bazaars hummed with transaction in a dozen languages: Greek, Latin, Turkish, Armenian, Arabic, Hebrew. Venetian galleys crowded the harbors alongside Genoese merchants from the independent colony of Galata across the Golden Horn. These Italians were supposed to be allies. They acted more like vultures circling something not quite dead. The intellectual life of the city glowed with a final brilliance. In monasteries and private homes, scholars preserved and copied ancient manuscripts, works of Plato and Aristotle, Euclid and Ptolemy, Homer and Herodotus. They debated theology with an intensity that seemed almost desperate, as if the right interpretation of Christ's nature might somehow save them. When Constantinople finally fell, these scholars would flee westward, carrying their books to Italy and igniting what history would call the Renaissance. But in 1450, they were still home, still believing their city was eternal. The streets told a different story. Walk through the Macy, the great colonnaded avenue that ran from the Million, the milestone from which all distances in the empire were measured, to the Forum of Constantine. The columns still stood, but many had lost their marble facing, exposing brick cores beneath. The bronze statues that once lined the route had been melted down for coinage decades ago. The shops that remained open huddled together for warmth and safety, islands of commerce in a sea of emptiness. At night, darkness swallowed most of the city. There was no longer enough oil for street lamps, no longer enough people to justify lighting them. Only near the harbors and around the major churches did torches flicker. Elsewhere, Constantinople belonged to shadows and memories. The churches remained magnificent. Beyond the Hagia Sophia, nor there was the Church of the Holy Apostles with its 5 domes, the resting place of emperors. The Chora Church, recently decorated with stunning frescoes and mosaics depicting biblical scenes, with a humanity and grace that seemed almost modern. The Pamakaristos Church, the Pantocrator Monastery. These buildings gleamed with gold and marble, their interiors fragrant with incense, their services conducted with a liturgical splendor unchanged since Justinian's time. Religion was both the city's soul and its deepest wound. In 1439, Emperor John VIII Palaiologos had traveled to Florence and signed a union between the Orthodox and Catholic churches, pledging submission to the Pope in exchange for Western military aid against the Ottoman Turks. The aid never came. The union was universally hated in Constantinople. "Era better the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat," the saying went. The Orthodox faithful would rather fall to Islam than submit to Rome. This was not mere stubbornness. It was the accumulated weight of centuries. The sack of Constantinople by Catholic crusaders in 1204, an atrocity so complete it still festered in Byzantine memory. The crusaders had raped nuns, murdered priests, looted churches, and crowned a Latin emperor in Hagia Sophia. The Greeks had reclaimed their city in 1261, but the wound never healed. So when their emperor signed away their faith for Western promises, the people of Constantinople refused. The churches remained divided. The promised help remained a fantasy. And beyond the walls, the Ottoman Empire grew stronger every day. Sultan Murad II ruled from Edirne, a mere 150 miles away. His armies had conquered most of the Balkans. Serbian and Bulgarian kingdoms had fallen. The Byzantine Empire had been reduced to Constantinople itself, a few islands, and the Peloponnese Peninsula in southern Greece. Territories that couldn't feed the capital, couldn't defend it, couldn't sustain it. Yet the Byzantines had survived worse. They had endured civil wars, plagues, heresies, and sieges beyond counting. Their diplomatic skill was legendary, playing enemies against each other, buying time with gold and marriage alliances, turning certain defeat into improbable survival. Surely they would find a way again. In 1450, that hope still lived. The harbor district of Kontoskalion teemed with activity. Fishermen hauled in catches from the Bosporus, bonito, mackerel, swordfish. Stevedores unloaded amphorae of wine from Crete, bales of wool from Anatolia. The Venetian quarter buzzed with its own separate life. These Catholic merchants maintaining their own churches, their own courts, their own armed guards. They paid taxes to Constantinople, but answered to Venice. The same was true for the Genoese across the water in Galata. Constantinople had become a city within a fortress within a memory. The hippodrome stood mostly unused, its bronze horses long since stolen by Venetian crusaders, its spina, the central barrier, still marked by ancient monuments, the Egyptian obelisk of Thutmose III, the serpent column from Delphi, the column of Constantine Porphyrogenitus. Once, this arena had held 100,000 spectators roaring for their favorite chariot racing teams, the Blues or the Greens. Now it hosted occasional festivals and military drills, a vast empty space that echoed with the cheers of ghosts. Emperor Constantine XI was 45 years old in 1450, unmarried, without an heir. He was a soldier emperor, competent and brave, but he ruled an empire that existed more in title than in territory. His court observed Byzantine ceremonial with meticulous care. The elaborate protocols, the purple robes, the acclamations in Greek that proclaimed him emperor and autocrat of the Romans. It was vital that nothing change, that every ritual be performed exactly as it had been for centuries. To admit that the empire was dying would make it so. The emperor's advisors were divided. Some urged reconciliation with the Catholic West at any price. Others advocated for resistance to the last, trusting in the Virgin Mary, to whom the city was consecrated, to deliver them as she had in past sieges. A few whispered that accommodation with the Ottomans might be possible, tributary status perhaps, preserving the city's Christian character while acknowledging Turkish suzerainty. No option was good. Every path led through darkness. The year 1450 passed quietly. Sultan Murad II, now in his late 40s, seemed content with his Balkan conquests. There was no immediate threat to Constantinople. Trade continued. The seasons turned. In the monasteries, monks copied manuscripts and prayed for deliverance. In the palaces, courtiers maneuvered for influence in an empire that no longer had any to grant. In the taverns near the harbor, sailors told stories of the old days when Byzantine fleets ruled the Mediterranean. Then in February 1451, Sultan Murad II died. His son Mehmed was 19 years old. They called him Mehmed the Young. They would soon call him Mehmed the Conqueror. He had been sultan once before, briefly during his father's first retirement, a period marked by the young man's perceived weakness and failure. When Murad returned to the throne, Mehmed had been humiliated, pushed aside, treated as inadequate. For 7 years he had waited, studied, planned, and nursed his ambitions like a flame in a shuttered room. Now the throne was his again. This time, no one would take it from him. The new sultan's first acts seemed conciliatory. He confirmed peace treaties with Venice, Hungary, and the Serbian despots. He sent friendly messages to Constantinople, reassuring Emperor Constantine XI that the existing treaty would be honored, and the annual tribute that Byzantium paid to the Ottoman court, a humiliating acknowledgement of dependence, would remain at its current level. The emperor breathed slightly easier. Perhaps the young sultan would prove as cautious as his father. Then in spring of 1452, Mehmed began building a fortress. The Bosporus Strait was Constantinople's lifeline, connecting the Sea of Marmara to the Black Sea, allowing ships to bring grain and supplies to the city. On the Asian shore, Murad II had built a fortress called Rumeli Hisarı decades earlier. Now Mehmed chose a site on the European shore, directly across from his father's fortress, at the narrowest point of the strait. He called it Rumeli Hisarı, the European fortress. Its purpose was unmistakable: to cut Constantinople off from the Black Sea, to strangle the city's supply lines, to demonstrate Ottoman control of the waters that the Byzantines had ruled for 1,000 years. Emperor Constantine sent ambassadors to protest. This construction violated their peace treaty. It was an act of aggression against Byzantine territory. Oh, the Sultan's grandfather had promised never to build fortifications so close to the city. Mehmed's response was chilling in its simplicity. "The lands are mine. I will build where I please." The ambassadors who delivered this protest never returned to Constantinople. Mehmed had them executed. Construction proceeded with terrifying speed. Thousands of laborers worked in shifts around the clock. Master masons laid massive stones. Carpenters built scaffolding. Soldiers guarded against any Byzantine interference. The fortress rose like a stone fist closing around the Bosporus. 3 massive towers connected by curtain walls, cannon emplacements, and a garrison strong enough to control all shipping through the strait. It was completed in August 1452, barely 4 months after it began. Mehmed installed cannons and ordered that every ship passing through the Bosporus must stop and pay tribute. Any vessel that refused would be sunk. A Venetian merchant galley tested this threat in November. Ottoman cannons reduced it to splinters. The survivors were impaled on stakes within sight of Constantinople's walls as a message. The rules had changed. Inside the city, the realization spread like winter cold. This sultan was different. This sultan was not interested in coexistence or tribute or maintaining the careful balance that had allowed Byzantium to survive. This sultan wanted Constantinople itself. The city that had been dying slowly for 2 centuries suddenly understood it might die very soon. Churches filled with people praying for deliverance. The emperor sent desperate letters westward, offering the union of churches, offering treasure, offering anything for military support. A few hundred Italian soldiers arrived, Genoese mercenaries under a condottiero named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, who knew more about defensive warfare than any man alive. The Venetian community debated whether to stay or flee. The Genoese in Galata made it clear they would remain neutral in any conflict between the Sultan and the emperor. Winter came. Constantinople huddled within its walls and waited. In the Ottoman capital of Edirne, Sultan Mehmed II gathered his advisors, his engineers, his generals. He commissioned a weapon unlike any the world had ever seen, a cannon so massive it required 60 oxen to move, so powerful it could hurl stone balls weighing over 1,200 pounds. A Hungarian engineer named Urban designed it, casting it in bronze, creating a monster that seemed to belong to myth rather than war. Mehmed studied maps of Constantinople. He memorized every tower, every gate, every weakness in the ancient walls. He assembled an army that would number over 80,000 men, janissaries, elite slave soldiers trained from childhood, Anatolian cavalry, irregular troops from across his empire, engineers and sappers, gunners and siege specialists. He was going to take the Queen of Cities. He was going to succeed where every other conqueror had failed. He was going to end Rome itself. In Constantinople, as 1453 began, the people walked their shrinking neighborhoods and looked at their magnificent churches and tried to imagine tomorrow. Some believed God would intervene. Some believed the West would send help. Some began quietly packing their valuables, planning escape. Emperor Constantine XI ordered repairs to the walls where earthquakes had weakened them. He stockpiled food and weapons. He drilled his few thousand defenders, citizens and monks alongside professional soldiers, old men and boys taking up arms because there was no one else. The population of 50,000 could not possibly man walls that stretched for 14 miles. They would have to be selective, concentrate forces at the most vulnerable points, and pray that ingenuity and desperation could overcome impossible odds. The sun still set beautifully over the Golden Horn. The Hagia Sophia's dome still seemed to float on light. The market still sold bread and fish and wine. Life continued because it had to, because surrendering to fear meant surrendering to death. But at night, standing on those ancient walls, you could see campfires beginning to gather in the distance. First dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. The Ottoman army was assembling. The siege was coming. Constantinople in early 1453 was the last ember of an empire that had illuminated the world for over 1,000 years. It was Rome's final city, Christendom's eastern bastion, the repository of classical learning and Orthodox faith. It was also a relic trying to survive in an age that had moved beyond it, a medieval city facing a modern army, ancient walls confronting gunpowder, faith defending against overwhelming force. The people of Constantinople knew their history. They knew their city had never fallen to siege. They knew the Virgin Mary was their protector, that prophecies promised deliverance, that somehow they would endure as they always had. What they didn't know, what they couldn't accept, was that history was about to end, that the world they had known, the civilization they embodied, the empire that had been eternal was entering its final days. The last light was fading, darkness was coming, and nothing would ever be the same.